Good evening. Tonight, we're going to trace the trajectory of a condition that has existed for as long as humans have experienced trauma, yet remained unnamed, misunderstood, and stigmatized for most of our history. This is a story about how war, psychology, politics, and human suffering intersected to create one of the most controversial diagnoses in modern medicine. This isn't a story about weakness or cowardice. This is a story about the invisible wounds that war inflicts, the systems that failed those who bore them, and the long, painful journey toward understanding what happens when the human mind is pushed beyond its breaking point. Before we begin this journey together, if you find value in these deep investigations into the hidden corners of medical and military history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, settle in. What you're about to hear may change how you understand mental illness, military history, and the very nature of psychological trauma itself. Before there was PTSD, before there was shell shock, before there was any name at all for what we're about to discuss, there were soldiers who came home from war changed in ways that no one could see, but everyone could sense. They would startle at sudden sounds. They would wake screaming in the night. They would stare into the distance with eyes that had seen too much. Their hands would shake uncontrollably. Some could no longer speak. Others could not stop weeping. Throughout history, these men were called many things. In ancient Greece, they were thought to be cursed by the gods for the atrocities they had committed in battle. During the American Civil War, they suffered from soldier's heart, or irritable heart, a condition attributed to the physical strain of carrying heavy equipment and marching long distances. After the Franco-Prussian War, German physicians described fright neurosis. But none of these terms captured the full scope of what was happening. They were fragments of understanding, glimpses of a phenomenon that would not be fully recognized for another century. The First World War changed everything. Not because the psychological casualties of war were new, but because the scale was unprecedented and impossible to ignore. Between 1914 and 1918, millions of men from every corner of Europe and beyond were thrown into a type of warfare that was fundamentally different from anything that had come before. They lived in trenches, often for months at a time, in conditions of unimaginable filth and deprivation. They were subjected to constant artillery bombardment, the shells screaming overhead day and night, exploding with devastating force. The earth shook, the air filled with shrapnel, poison gas, and the screams of dying men. And then there were the attacks, going over the top, climbing out of the relative safety of the trench and advancing across no man's land into machine gun fire and artillery barrages. Entire battalions would be cut down in minutes. Men would watch their friends torn apart, blown to pieces, drowning in mud. And those who survived would be ordered to do it again the next day, and the day after that, until they were killed, wounded, or broken. By 1915, British military hospitals were filling with men who had no visible injuries, but were completely incapacitated. They trembled violently. They could not walk, though their legs were uninjured. They were mute, though their vocal cords were intact. They suffered from what appeared to be seizures, paralysis, blindness, deafness. Medical officers were baffled. What was wrong with these men? A British psychologist named Charles Samuel Myers, serving with the Royal Army Medical Corps, began studying these cases. In 1915, he published a paper in the medical journal The Lancet describing what he called shell shock. The term was meant to suggest that the symptoms were caused by the physical concussive effects of exploding artillery shells, that the brain had been somehow damaged by the force of the blast. It was a comforting theory because it implied a physical injury, something honourable, something beyond the soldier's control. But Myers himself was not entirely convinced. He suspected that the true cause was psychological, that these men were suffering from the accumulated trauma of their experiences. But to say so openly, to suggest that the symptoms were mental rather than physical, was dangerous. In the rigid military culture of the time, psychological breakdown was seen as weakness, as cowardice, as a failure of character. A man who broke down mentally was not wounded. He was deficient. The term shell shock spread rapidly through the military and into public consciousness. It was vague enough to encompass a wide range of symptoms, and it allowed soldiers and their families to maintain dignity. A man suffering from shell shock had been injured by the war, just as surely as if he'd been shot. But the military authorities were increasingly uncomfortable with the diagnosis. By 1917, tens of thousands of British soldiers had been classified as shell shock cases and evacuated from the front lines. This was a manpower crisis. The army needed soldiers, and shell shock was removing them from combat. In late 1917, a British military committee was convened to study the problem. Their conclusion was damning. They determined that shell shock was, in most cases, not a result of physical injury, but of emotional collapse or lack of moral fibre. The term itself was officially banned from military medical records. Soldiers could no longer be diagnosed with shell shock. Instead, they were classified as either wounded if they had been close to an explosion, or sick if they had not. And those classified as sick were often treated with suspicion and contempt. The treatment prescribed for these men was often brutal. A Scottish physician named Lewis Yayland, working at the National Hospital for the Paralysed and Epileptic in London, pioneered a treatment based on the belief that shell shock was a form of hysteria that could be cured through discipline and willpower. His method involved electric shock therapy, not the controlled electroconvulsive therapy used in modern psychiatry, but crude, painful shocks applied to the affected body parts. A soldier who could not speak would have electrodes attached to his throat and would be shocked repeatedly while being commanded to speak. A soldier who could not walk would be shocked on his legs and forced to stand. Yayland's case notes, preserved in medical archives, make for disturbing reading. He describes patients screaming in pain, begging for the treatment to stop while he continued, insisting that they could be cured if they simply exerted their will. In some cases, the treatment appeared to work. Soldiers would regain their speech or their ability to walk. But what Yayland interpreted as a cure was more likely a desperate attempt by traumatized men to escape further torture. The underlying psychological damage remained, often worsening. Other physicians took a more humane approach. W.H.R. Rivers, a British anthropologist and psychiatrist, treated shell shock patients at Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland. Rivers believed that the symptoms were a result of repressed traumatic memories, and that the path to recovery lay in helping patients confront and process those memories. He used a form of talk therapy, encouraging his patients to speak about their experiences, to relive the trauma in a safe environment. His most famous patient was the war poet Siegfried Sassoon, who wrote about his experiences and his treatment in ways that gave voice to a generation's anguish. But Rivers' methods were time-consuming and required a level of psychological sophistication that most military doctors did not possess. And the military establishment remained deeply ambivalent about acknowledging the psychological impact of combat. To do so would be to admit that war could break even the strongest men, that courage and discipline had limits. It was a truth that contradicted everything the military culture stood for. The most tragic consequence of this denial was what happened to soldiers who were accused of cowardice. During the First World War, the British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers for cowardice or desertion. Many, perhaps most of these men were almost certainly suffering from what we would now recognise as severe PTSD. They had reached a point where they could no longer function, where the instinct for self-preservation overwhelmed everything else. They ran, or they refused to fight, or they simply broke down, and for this they were shot by firing squad. Private Harry Farr was one such case. In 1916, after months of frontline service, he began trembling uncontrollably and could not stop. He was diagnosed with shell shock and sent to a hospital. When he was returned to his unit, he broke down again, unable to rejoin the fighting. He was court-martialed for cowardice and executed. He was 25 years old. It would be 90 years before the British government officially pardoned him and the others executed for cowardice, acknowledging that they had been victims of a condition the military did not understand. The American military, when it entered the war in 1917, initially dismissed shell shock as a peculiarly British problem, a result of insufficient training or weak morale. But American soldiers began exhibiting the same symptoms. By 1918, American military psychiatrists were grappling with thousands of cases. They developed their own terminology, referring to the condition as war neurosis or combat fatigue, but the underlying phenomenon was the same. When the war ended in November 1918, the true scale of the psychological casualties became apparent. In Britain alone, over 80,000 men had been treated for shell shock, and many thousands more had never been diagnosed or treated at all. They returned to civilian life carrying invisible wounds, unable to work, unable to sleep, haunted by memories they could not escape. The government, overwhelmed by the cost of caring for physically wounded veterans, had little interest in acknowledging or treating psychological injuries. Many shell shock victims were simply abandoned, left to live on the streets or to struggle in silence. The period between the two world wars was a time of willful forgetting. The nations that had been devastated by the First World War wanted to move on, to rebuild, to return to normalcy. The veterans who had suffered psychological trauma were an uncomfortable reminder of the war's true cost. The prevailing attitude was that these men should simply get over it, that they should be grateful to have survived at all. In the United States, the Bonus Army March of 1932 brought the plight of veterans into sharp focus. Over 40,000 veterans and their families marched on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of bonuses that had been promised to them. They set up camps in the city, and among them were many men still suffering from the psychological effects of the war. The government's response was to send in the army to forcibly evict them, using tear gas and bayonets. It was a brutal illustration of how little regard the authorities had for the suffering of veterans. The medical and psychiatric establishment also moved away from the study of war-related trauma. Shell shock had been a wartime phenomenon, and with the war over, there seemed to be little reason to continue researching it. Psychoanalysis, dominated by Freudian theory, offered its own explanations for trauma, focusing on childhood experiences and unconscious conflicts, rather than the acute stress of combat. Veterans seeking help were often told that their symptoms were rooted in repressed sexual desires or unresolved Oedipal complexes, explanations that must have seemed both absurd and insulting to men who had survived the trenches. There were exceptions. Abram Gardiner, an American psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, worked extensively with traumatized veterans in the 1920s and 1930s. In 1941, he published a book titled The Traumatic Neuroses of War, in which he described in detail the symptoms that would later become the core criteria for PTSD: intrusive memories, nightmares, hyperarousal, avoidance of reminders of the trauma, and a persistent sense of threat. Gardiner argued that these were not manifestations of pre-existing psychological weakness, but were the direct result of overwhelming traumatic experiences. His work was ahead of its time, but it was largely ignored by the broader psychiatric community. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the lessons of the First World War regarding psychological casualties had been largely forgotten or deliberately suppressed. Military planners believed that with better selection processes, better training, and better leadership, psychological breakdowns could be prevented. They were catastrophically wrong. The scale and intensity of the Second World War exceeded even that of the First. The conflict was global, involving massive aerial bombardments, armoured warfare, amphibious assaults, and jungle fighting. Civilians were targeted on an unprecedented scale. Entire cities were levelled. And once again, soldiers and civilians alike began to exhibit the same symptoms that had been called shell shock a generation earlier. The American military, determined not to repeat what it saw as the mistakes of the previous war, initially refused to use the term shell shock. Instead, they referred to psychological casualties as cases of war neurosis or combat exhaustion. The thinking was that these were temporary conditions brought on by fatigue, and that with rest and support close to the front lines, men could be returned to duty quickly. This approach was formalized in a doctrine known as proximity, immediacy, and expectancy, or PIE. The idea was that soldiers showing signs of psychological breakdown should be treated as close to the combat zone as possible, proximity, as soon as symptoms appeared, immediacy, and with the expectation that they would return to duty, expectancy. In practice, this meant that men were given a few days of rest, some hot food, perhaps a chance to talk to a chaplain or a psychiatrist, and then sent back into combat. In some cases, this approach worked. Soldiers who had reached a temporary breaking point were able to recover enough to continue fighting. But for many others, it was a cruel charade. They were returned to the same situations that had broken them in the first place, and they broke again, often more severely. Some estimates suggest that up to 40% of all American casualties in the European theatre were psychiatric in nature. The situation was similar in the Pacific theatre, though the nature of the combat was different. The jungle fighting in places like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and Iwo Jima was characterized by intense heat, disease, isolation, and an enemy who employed tactics that included surprise attacks and suicidal charges. The psychological strain was immense. Marines and soldiers reported that the jungle itself felt hostile, that the constant threat of ambush and the inability to see the enemy created a state of perpetual terror. One of the most harrowing accounts from the Pacific came from a Marine psychiatrist named Frederick Hansen, who worked with combat troops on Okinawa. He described soldiers who had been in combat for weeks without relief, men who could no longer sleep because they were convinced they would be killed if they closed their eyes. He described men who had seen so much death that they had become emotionally numb, unable to feel anything at all. And he described men who'd committed acts of violence so extreme that they could no longer reconcile them with their sense of who they were. Hansen argued that every soldier had a breaking point, that there was a cumulative effect of combat stress that would eventually overwhelm even the strongest and most well-trained individuals. He called it the old sergeant syndrome, noting that even the most experienced and capable soldiers would eventually reach a point where they could no longer function. His observations were supported by data showing that the rate of psychiatric casualties increased with the length of time a unit spent in combat. The British military faced similar challenges. During the Battle of Britain, RAF pilots flew multiple sorties per day, often against overwhelming odds. The constant stress, combined with the loss of friends and comrades, took a severe toll. Pilots began to exhibit symptoms similar to those of shell shock: nightmares, hypervigilance, inability to concentrate, and a pervasive sense of doom. The RAF responded by rotating pilots out of combat and providing rest periods, an approach that helped but did not eliminate the problem. The most controversial aspect of the military's handling of psychological casualties during World War II was the fate of General George S. Patton. In August 1943, while visiting wounded soldiers in Sicily, Patton encountered two soldiers who had been hospitalized for combat exhaustion. Enraged by what he perceived as cowardice, Patton slapped both men and called them cowards. He demanded they be returned to duty immediately. When news of the incidents leaked to the press, there was a public outcry. Patton was forced to apologize, but the incident highlighted the deep ambivalence within the military about acknowledging psychological trauma. Patton's attitude was not uncommon. Many officers believed that psychological breakdowns were a sign of weakness or poor leadership, and that the solution was discipline rather than treatment. This attitude persisted despite overwhelming evidence that combat stress affected soldiers regardless of their courage or character. As the war drew to a close in 1945, hundreds of thousands of veterans returned home carrying the psychological scars of combat. The US government, having learned from the failures after the First World War, made efforts to provide support. The GI Bill offered education and housing benefits, and the Veterans Administration expanded its mental health services. But the stigma surrounding mental illness remained strong, and many veterans were reluctant to seek help. The Korean War, which began in 1950, offered an opportunity to apply the lessons learned from World War II. The American military implemented the PE approach more systematically, and psychiatric casualty rates were indeed lower than in the previous conflict. But this was in part because the war was shorter and less intense for American forces, and because soldiers were rotated out of combat on a fixed schedule. The underlying problem, that combat could inflict lasting psychological damage, remained unaddressed. It was the Vietnam War that would finally force a reckoning. Vietnam was different from previous conflicts in almost every way. It was a guerrilla war with no clear front lines, no safe rear areas. American soldiers fought an enemy that could not always be distinguished from civilians. They were often young, poorly prepared, and sent to fight in a war that lacked clear objectives or public support. And critically, they served on a rotation system that sent them to Vietnam for a one-year tour of duty, after which they were sent home, often within days of leaving the combat zone. This rapid transition from war to peace turned out to be deeply traumatic. Soldiers who had been in combat just days earlier would find themselves back in the United States, expected to resume normal life with no period of decompression or processing. Many reported feeling disoriented, angry, and unable to relate to people who had not shared their experiences. They had nightmares, intrusive memories, and violent outbursts. They self-medicated with alcohol and drugs, and they found that the country they had returned to did not want to hear about what they had been through. The anti-war movement, which had grown powerful by the late 1960s, often directed its anger not just at the government, but at the soldiers themselves. Veterans were sometimes spat upon, called baby killers, and treated with contempt. This added another layer of trauma, moral injury, the deep psychological wound that comes from having participated in acts that violate one's own ethical code, combined with rejection by the society they had served. By the mid-1970s, it was clear that something was deeply wrong. Veterans were showing up at VA hospitals in alarming numbers, reporting symptoms that doctors recognized from previous wars, but had never seen in such concentration or persistence. They were also dying at alarming rates from suicide, overdose, and accidents. A grassroots movement of veterans and their advocates began demanding recognition and treatment. A key figure in this movement was a psychiatrist named Chaim Shatan. Shatan had begun working with Vietnam veterans in rap groups, informal therapy sessions where veterans could talk openly about their experiences without judgment. He noticed consistent patterns in their symptoms: nightmares of combat, flashbacks so vivid that veterans would dive for cover or attack people they mistook for enemies, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and a profound sense of alienation. In 1972, Shatan published an article in the New York Times titled Post-Vietnam Syndrome, describing these symptoms and arguing that they represented a specific diagnosable condition. He was joined by other psychiatrists and psychologists, including Robert J. Lifton and Sarah Haley, who conducted research and advocacy on behalf of traumatized veterans. Their efforts culminated in a lobbying campaign to have this constellation of symptoms recognized as an official psychiatric diagnosis. This was not just an academic exercise. Without an official diagnosis, veterans could not receive disability benefits or appropriate treatment from the VA. They were being told that their problems were pre-existing personality disorders, or that they were malingering. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as the DSM-3. This edition included, for the first time, a diagnosis called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The inclusion of PTSD in the DSM was a watershed moment, the culmination of decades of advocacy and research. The diagnostic criteria for PTSD, as defined in the DSM-3, required that an individual had been exposed to a traumatic event outside the range of normal human experience, and that they exhibited a specific set of symptoms organized into 3 clusters: re-experiencing intrusive memories, nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance of reminders of the trauma, emotional numbing, and hyperarousal, insomnia, irritability, exaggerated startle response, hypervigilance. The creation of the PTSD diagnosis was revolutionary for several reasons. First, it shifted the focus from the individual's psychological makeup to the event itself. Previous psychiatric thinking had often attributed trauma responses to pre-existing vulnerabilities or neuroses. PTSD, by contrast, acknowledged that certain experiences were so overwhelming that they could damage anyone, regardless of their psychological strength or resilience. Second, PTSD was defined in a way that was not specific to combat. The diagnostic criteria applied equally to survivors of rape, natural disasters, accidents, and other traumatic events. This universality was both a strength and a source of controversy. It meant that the experiences of veterans were validated alongside those of other trauma survivors, but it also meant that the unique aspects of combat trauma were sometimes overlooked. Third, the recognition of PTSD forced the VA and the broader medical system to develop appropriate treatments. Suddenly, there was a diagnosis with a name, with research behind it, and with a constituency of veterans demanding care. Specialized PTSD treatment programs were established at VA hospitals across the country. Therapists were trained in trauma-focused treatments. Research funding was allocated to study the condition and develop better interventions. But the creation of PTSD also sparked intense debate. Some psychiatrists argued that the diagnosis was too broad, that it pathologized normal reactions to stressful events. Others argued that it was too narrow, that it failed to capture the full complexity of trauma responses. There were concerns that PTSD would be overdiagnosed, used as a label for anyone experiencing distress or underdiagnosed, with gatekeepers denying treatment to those who didn't fit the exact criteria. There were also political dimensions to the debate. Conservative critics suggested that PTSD was a way for weak individuals to claim victim status and avoid personal responsibility. Some argued that the diagnosis was being used by anti-war activists to undermine military morale and recruitment. On the other side, advocates argued that resistance to the diagnosis was rooted in a desire to deny the true cost of war and to avoid accountability for sending soldiers into harm's way. As PTSD became an established diagnosis, researchers began to investigate what actually happens in the brain and body when someone experiences trauma. The findings have been profound and have fundamentally changed our understanding of psychological injury. One of the key insights came from studies of the stress response system. When a person perceives a threat, the body activates a cascade of physiological reactions designed to promote survival. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain, acts as an alarm system, triggering the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, muscles tense, and the senses become hyperacute. This is the fight-or-flight response, and it is essential for survival in dangerous situations. Under normal circumstances, once the threat has passed, the stress response shuts down, and the body returns to a state of equilibrium. But in individuals with PTSD, this system becomes dysregulated. The amygdala becomes hyperactive, triggering stress responses even in the absence of real danger. The hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for contextualizing memories and distinguishing past from present, shows reduced activity and even physical shrinkage in some PTSD patients. This means that traumatic memories are not properly integrated and contextualized. Instead of being stored as past events, they are experienced as immediate threats. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function and emotional regulation, also shows altered activity in PTSD. Normally, the prefrontal cortex can dampen the amygdala's alarm signals, providing a sense of safety and control. But in PTSD, this dampening function is impaired, leaving the person at the mercy of their stress responses. Brain imaging studies using fMRI and PET scans have provided visual evidence of these differences. When PTSD patients are exposed to reminders of their trauma, their brains show dramatically different patterns of activation compared to people without PTSD. The amygdala lights up intensely, while activity in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus diminishes. It is as if the rational, thinking parts of the brain go offline and the primitive, survival-oriented parts take over. Research has also revealed changes at the molecular level. Studies of stress hormones have shown that some PTSD patients have abnormally low levels of cortisol, the opposite of what one might expect. The explanation appears to be that chronic activation of the stress response system leads to a kind of burnout, where the adrenal glands can no longer produce adequate amounts of the hormone. Other studies have found changes in gene expression related to stress response, and there is growing evidence that trauma can leave epigenetic marks that may even be passed on to future generations. One of the most important discoveries has been the role of memory consolidation in PTSD. Normally, when we experience an event, the memory goes through a process of consolidation, becoming integrated into our narrative understanding of our lives. But traumatic memories often fail to consolidate properly. Instead, they remain fragmented, disorganized, and emotionally charged. They can be triggered by sensory cues, a smell, a sound, a visual stimulus, and when triggered, they are re-experienced with the same emotional intensity as the original event. This is the basis of flashbacks, one of the hallmark symptoms of PTSD. Understanding the neurobiology of PTSD has been crucial for developing effective treatments. It has shifted the conversation from one of blame and weakness to one of injury and healing. PTSD is not a character flaw or a lack of resilience. It is a measurable, observable alteration in brain function that can, in many cases, be treated. Treating PTSD has proven to be one of the most challenging tasks in modern psychiatry. Unlike a broken bone or an infection, psychological trauma cannot be easily mended with a single intervention. Recovery is often a long, difficult process that requires sustained effort, skilled therapists, and a supportive environment. The most effective treatments for PTSD fall into two main categories: psychotherapy and medication. Among psychotherapies, two approaches have the strongest evidence base: cognitive processing therapy, CPT, and prolonged exposure, PE. Cognitive processing therapy focuses on helping patients identify and challenge distorted thoughts related to the trauma. Many PTSD patients develop beliefs like, "I should have prevented it," "I can't trust anyone," or "the world is completely dangerous." These thoughts, while understandable given their experiences, often maintain the disorder and prevent healing. CPT teaches patients to examine these beliefs, evaluate the evidence for and against them, and develop more balanced, adaptive ways of thinking. Prolonged exposure therapy is based on the principle that avoidance maintains PTSD. Patients with PTSD naturally avoid reminders of their trauma because these reminders trigger intense distress. But this avoidance prevents the brain from learning that these reminders are not actually dangerous, that the trauma is in the past. PE involves gradually systematically exposing patients to trauma-related memories and situations in a controlled, safe environment. This might mean recounting the traumatic event in detail repeatedly, or visiting places that remind them of the trauma. Through this process, the emotional intensity of the memories gradually decreases, and patients regain a sense of control. Both CPT and PE require patients to confront painful memories and emotions, which makes them difficult treatments. Many patients drop out before completing the full course of therapy. But for those who complete them, the results can be transformative. Studies show that 50–60% of patients who complete CPT or PE no longer meet criteria for PTSD at the end of treatment. Another evidence-based therapy is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. This somewhat controversial treatment involves having patients recall traumatic memories while simultaneously engaging in bilateral stimulation, typically by following a therapist's finger moving back and forth across their field of vision. The exact mechanism by which EMDR works is not fully understood, and some researchers believe it is essentially a form of exposure therapy with an added element that may or may not contribute to its effectiveness. Nevertheless, it has a significant evidence base and is widely used. Medications also play a role in PTSD treatment, though they are generally considered adjunctive rather than curative. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, such as sertraline and paroxetine, are the only medications approved by the FDA specifically for PTSD. They can help reduce some symptoms, particularly depression and anxiety, but they do not fully resolve the disorder. Other medications are sometimes used off-label, including prazosin for nightmares and mood stabilizers or antipsychotics for particularly severe cases. Recently, there has been growing interest in novel pharmacological approaches. Research into MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD has shown promising results, with some studies reporting that over 60% of participants no longer met PTSD criteria after treatment. The FDA has granted breakthrough therapy designation to this approach, and it may become an approved treatment in the coming years. Similarly, there is emerging research on the use of ketamine and psilocybin for trauma-related disorders, though these remain experimental. Beyond formal treatments, many aspects of recovery involve rebuilding a life. PTSD often destroys relationships, careers, and sense of purpose. Treatment must address not just symptoms, but also help patients reconnect with meaning and community. Peer support groups where veterans or trauma survivors can share experiences with others who understand have proven invaluable. Service dogs trained to assist with PTSD symptoms have helped many veterans regain independence and manage hypervigilance and anxiety. But despite these advances, access to effective treatment remains a major problem. There are not enough trauma-trained therapists, especially in rural areas. Wait times at VA facilities can be months or years. Many insurance plans do not adequately cover intensive trauma treatment, and the stigma surrounding mental health treatment, while diminished, has not disappeared. Many people, especially veterans and first responders, still view seeking help as a sign of weakness. While PTSD was initially defined and studied in the context of combat trauma, it has become clear that the disorder can result from a wide range of traumatic experiences. Sexual assault survivors, survivors of childhood abuse, refugees fleeing war zones, first responders, survivors of natural disasters, victims of violent crime, all of these populations show high rates of PTSD. In fact, some research suggests that the type of trauma most likely to cause PTSD is not combat, but interpersonal violence, particularly sexual assault. Studies have found that up to 50% of rape survivors develop PTSD, a higher rate than for combat veterans. This may be because interpersonal trauma, especially when perpetrated by someone known to the victim, shatters fundamental assumptions about safety and trust in a particularly profound way. Childhood trauma deserves special attention. Children who experience abuse, neglect, or witness violence are at high risk for developing PTSD and a range of other psychiatric and medical problems. The Adverse Childhood Experiences (AC) study, a landmark piece of research conducted in the 1990s, demonstrated that childhood trauma has long-lasting effects on physical and mental health, increasing the risk of heart disease, diabetes, addiction, depression, and early death. Moreover, trauma in childhood can alter the developing brain in ways that make individuals more vulnerable to stress throughout their lives. The hippocampus, which is still developing during childhood, appears particularly susceptible to the effects of chronic stress. Children who experience severe trauma may develop what has been termed complex PTSD, a variant of the disorder that includes difficulty regulating emotions, problems with self-perception, and disturbed relationships, in addition to the classic PTSD symptoms. The recognition that PTSD can result from many types of trauma has led to efforts to make treatment more accessible to all trauma survivors, not just veterans. Rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, and community mental health centers have increasingly incorporated trauma-informed care. Schools have begun implementing trauma-sensitive practices, recognizing that many children have experienced ACEs and need support. But there are also concerns about the expansion of the PTSD diagnosis. Some critics argue that it has become too broad, that it medicalizes normal stress responses, and that it encourages people to identify as victims rather than survivors. There is a tension between validating suffering and fostering resilience, between acknowledging trauma and moving forward. PTSD has become entangled in broader cultural and political debates in ways that the original advocates for the diagnosis probably did not anticipate. The disorder has been weaponized by different sides in culture wars, each claiming to speak for trauma survivors while advancing their own agendas. On one side, there are those who argue that America has become too focused on trauma, too willing to label people as damaged or fragile. They point to the proliferation of trigger warnings on college campuses, the emphasis on safe spaces, and the tendency to attribute any emotional distress to trauma. They argue that this culture of victimhood is harmful, that it encourages people to see themselves as permanently damaged and incapable of resilience. On the other side, advocates argue that this criticism minimizes real suffering and perpetuates the stigma that prevented trauma recognition in the first place. They argue that acknowledging trauma and providing support is not creating victims, but rather validating experiences and facilitating healing. They point out that many of the loudest critics have never experienced severe trauma themselves and are therefore unqualified to judge how survivors should respond. The debate has been particularly intense around military service and veterans. Some conservative commentators have suggested that the prevalence of PTSD diagnoses among recent veterans is a sign that the modern military has become too soft, that previous generations of soldiers endured worse and did not develop such problems. This argument conveniently ignores the extensive historical evidence of psychological casualties in every war, often under different names but with identical symptoms. At the same time, some anti-war activists have used PTSD statistics to argue against military interventions, framing every service member as a potential victim of psychological injury. This well-intentioned advocacy can inadvertently stigmatize veterans, suggesting that they are all damaged or dangerous, which most veterans find offensive and inaccurate. The truth, as usual, is more complicated. PTSD is neither universal among trauma survivors nor trivial. Some people exposed to severe trauma develop the disorder, and others do not. Those who develop it are not weak, and those who do not are not simply stronger. There are multiple factors that influence who develops PTSD, including the nature and severity of the trauma, previous trauma exposure, genetic vulnerability, available support, and individual coping styles. While much of the historical focus on PTSD has been on combat veterans, another population that experiences trauma at extraordinarily high rates is first responders, police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and emergency medical technicians. These individuals regularly encounter death, injury, and human suffering as part of their jobs. They are often the first to arrive at scenes of violence, accidents, and disasters, and the psychological toll can be devastating. Studies have found that up to 30% of first responders develop PTSD at some point in their careers. The rate of suicide among police officers and firefighters is significantly higher than the general population, yet the culture within these professions often mirrors the military culture of earlier eras. There is intense stigma around admitting psychological struggle, and seeking mental health treatment is often seen as a career-ending admission of weakness. The traumatic exposures that first responders experience are often different from those of combat veterans. Rather than a single overwhelming event or a period of sustained combat, first responders typically experience repeated cumulative trauma over the course of their careers. They might respond to hundreds or thousands of traumatic incidents, each one adding to the psychological burden. This cumulative effect can lead to what some researchers call complex PTSD, or operational stress injury. Certain types of calls are particularly traumatic. Any incident involving children tends to have a profound impact. Suicides where the first responder finds the body, line-of-duty deaths where a fellow officer or firefighter is killed, mass casualty incidents, and incidents where the first responder knows the victim personally. A paramedic named Sarah, whose story was documented in a study on first responder PTSD, described responding to a car accident and realizing that one of the victims was her neighbor's child. Despite her training and years of experience, she froze. She could not perform the medical procedures she had done hundreds of times before. Other paramedics had to take over. Afterward, she began experiencing intense flashbacks, nightmares, and guilt. She blamed herself for freezing, convinced that she had somehow contributed to the child's death, even though the child had died instantly in the crash. She eventually left her job and spent years in therapy working through the trauma. The problem is compounded by the fact that first responders often lack the institutional support that military veterans have access to. While the VA system has significant problems, it at least represents a dedicated infrastructure for treating combat-related PTSD. Most police and fire departments have minimal mental health resources. Peer support programs exist in some agencies, but they are often underfunded and understaffed. Many first responders who need treatment must seek it on their own time and often at their own expense. There is also the issue of organizational culture. In many departments, there is an unspoken expectation that first responders should be able to handle anything, that they should not be affected by what they see. Showing emotion or admitting that a call has gotten to you can be seen as unprofessional. This culture of stoicism and toughness, while perhaps intended to maintain operational effectiveness, creates an environment where people suffer in silence. Some progressive departments have begun to change this culture. They have implemented mandatory debriefings after traumatic incidents, provided access to confidential counseling, and trained supervisors to recognize signs of psychological distress. Some have adopted peer support models, where first responders who have successfully navigated their own trauma can help others. These efforts show promise, but they remain the exception rather than the rule. Despite being an established diagnosis for over 40 years, PTSD remains controversial in many ways. One ongoing debate concerns the definition itself. The DSM has been revised multiple times since 1980, and each revision has tweaked the criteria for PTSD. The current version, DSM-5, published in 2013, made significant changes, including adding a fourth symptom cluster focused on negative alterations in cognition and mood. Some researchers argue that PTSD as currently defined is too heterogeneous, that it lumps together different types of trauma responses that might be better understood as distinct conditions. Others argue that the focus on a discrete set of symptoms misses the broader impact of trauma, particularly in cases of prolonged or repeated trauma. This latter concern led to the proposal of a new diagnosis called complex PTSD, which is included in the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11, but not in the DSM-5. Complex PTSD includes the core PTSD symptoms plus additional symptoms related to disturbances in self-organization, problems with emotion regulation, negative self-concept, and interpersonal difficulties. This diagnosis is meant to capture the effects of prolonged trauma such as childhood abuse, captivity, or long-term domestic violence. Another controversy involves the trauma requirement itself. The DSM-5 defines a traumatic event as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. But what about other intensely distressing experiences? What about people who develop PTSD-like symptoms after being relentlessly bullied, or after a contentious divorce, or after being publicly humiliated? Some researchers argue that the definition should be broader, encompassing any event that overwhelms an individual's coping capacity. Others argue that expanding the definition too much would dilute the meaning of trauma and potentially trivialize the experiences of those who have faced genuine life-threatening situations. There is also ongoing debate about malingering and exaggeration of symptoms. In contexts where PTSD can lead to disability benefits, legal compensation, or avoidance of criminal responsibility, there is an incentive for some individuals to fake or exaggerate symptoms. Studies suggest that malingering is relatively rare, but it does occur and clinicians must be alert to it. The challenge is to screen for malingering without becoming cynical or dismissive of genuine suffering. One of the most contentious recent debates has been about trigger warnings. These are alerts placed before content that might be distressing to trauma survivors, warning them about material that could trigger a PTSD response. Proponents argue that trigger warnings are a simple courtesy that allows trauma survivors to prepare themselves or avoid content that might be re-traumatizing. Critics argue that trigger warnings are overused, that they encourage avoidance, which maintains PTSD rather than resolving it, and that they are part of a broader trend of excessive sensitivity and fragility. Research on this question has produced mixed results. Some studies suggest that trigger warnings do not significantly help trauma survivors and may actually increase anxiety by priming individuals to expect distress. Other studies suggest that they can be helpful when used appropriately for genuinely graphic or disturbing content. The debate continues, often generating more heat than light. As our understanding of PTSD has deepened, new avenues for treatment and prevention have emerged. One promising area is early intervention. Research suggests that there may be a window of opportunity immediately after a traumatic event, when interventions can prevent PTSD from developing. Some studies have explored the use of brief, structured interventions in emergency rooms or trauma centers, providing education, support, and simple cognitive techniques to individuals who have just experienced trauma. Another approach involves memory reconsolidation. When a traumatic memory is retrieved, it becomes briefly malleable before being stored again, a process called reconsolidation. Researchers are exploring whether interventions during this window, such as certain medications or therapeutic techniques, can alter the emotional intensity of the memory, essentially updating it so it is less traumatic when recalled in the future. There is also growing interest in resilience training as a preventive measure. Rather than waiting for trauma to occur and then treating PTSD, could we prepare individuals to be more psychologically resilient so they are less likely to develop the disorder? The military has invested heavily in resilience training programs, teaching soldiers stress management, cognitive skills, and emotional regulation before they deploy. The evidence for the effectiveness of these programs is mixed, but the concept remains appealing. Technology is also playing an increasing role. Virtual reality exposure therapy allows patients to be gradually exposed to trauma-related stimuli in a highly controlled environment. For combat veterans, this might mean a virtual recreation of an Iraqi marketplace or an Afghan village, where they can practice confronting trauma reminders without actual danger. Early studies suggest that VR exposure can be as effective as traditional exposure therapy and may be more engaging for some patients. Neuroscience continues to reveal new insights. Researchers are investigating whether brain stimulation techniques, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, can be used to modulate activity in brain regions involved in PTSD. There is also interest in using brain imaging to predict who is most likely to develop PTSD after trauma, potentially allowing for targeted early intervention. Perhaps most importantly, there is a growing recognition that treating PTSD requires addressing the social and economic factors that contribute to vulnerability and that impede recovery. Poverty, homelessness, unemployment, lack of social support, all of these make it harder to recover from trauma. Effective treatment, therefore, cannot be purely medical. It must be embedded in a broader framework of social support and community. Behind all the statistics, the diagnostic criteria, the policy debates, and the research findings are human beings. People who have endured experiences that would break most of us, who carry scars that no one can see and who often struggle in silence with wounds that will not heal. There is the story of Marcus, a Marine who served 3 tours in Iraq. He saw friends die, killed enemy combatants, and was present at a checkpoint when a car bomb detonated, killing a family of civilians. He came home and could not sleep, could not hold down a job, could not stop seeing the faces of the dead children every time he closed his eyes. He drank to numb the pain, lost his marriage, and came close to suicide. It took him 8 years to finally seek treatment at a VA hospital, where he went through prolonged exposure therapy. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder even than combat. But slowly, painfully, he began to heal. Today he works as a peer counsellor, helping other veterans navigate the path he travelled. There is the story of Elena, who was sexually assaulted at age 16. The legal system failed her. Her assailant was never charged. She developed PTSD, became hypervigilant, could not bear to be touched, and struggled with overwhelming shame and self-blame. She dropped out of school, isolated herself, and began self-harming. It was not until she connected with a trauma-informed therapist in her 20s that she began to understand that her symptoms were not her fault, that they were a normal response to an abnormal experience. Through cognitive processing therapy, she learned to challenge her self-blame and to reclaim her sense of safety and agency. There is the story of David, a firefighter who responded to a multi-vehicle crash on a highway. One of the vehicles had caught fire and there were people trapped inside. He and his crew tried desperately to free them, but the flames were too intense. He heard them screaming as they burned. That sound haunted him for years. He developed severe PTSD, began having panic attacks on the job, and eventually had to retire on medical disability. He felt he had failed, that he was weak for not being able to handle it. It was only through peer support with other first responders that he began to understand that his reaction was not weakness, but a normal human response to an unbearable situation. These are just 3 stories among millions. Each person's experience of trauma is unique, and each person's path to healing, if they find one, is different. What unites them is the fundamental human capacity to be wounded by experience and the equally fundamental capacity to heal. The history of PTSD is a history of denial, recognition, and struggle. For most of human history, the psychological wounds of war and trauma were invisible, unspoken, and unacknowledged. Soldiers who broke under the strain were considered cowards. Survivors of assault or disaster who could not move on were told to simply get over it. The suffering was real, but the systems designed to help were indifferent or actively hostile. The recognition of PTSD as a legitimate medical condition was a hard-won victory, achieved through the advocacy of veterans, clinicians, and researchers who refused to accept the status quo. It represented a fundamental shift in how we understand the relationship between experience and mental health, acknowledging that trauma can wound the mind as surely as a bullet can wound the body. But recognition is only the first step. We have made progress in understanding PTSD, in developing treatments, and in reducing stigma. But the work is far from complete. Too many people still suffer in silence. Too many lack access to effective treatment. Too many are blamed for symptoms they cannot control. And too many take their own lives because the pain becomes unbearable. The shadow that trauma casts is long. It extends across generations as the children of traumatized parents grow up in environments shaped by unresolved pain. It extends across communities as collective traumas like war, genocide, or natural disaster leave lasting marks. And it extends across societies, shaping how we respond to violence, how we care for the vulnerable, and how we understand the limits of human endurance. But shadows exist only in the presence of light. The light here is knowledge, compassion, and commitment to healing. Every person who speaks openly about their trauma and their recovery chips away at stigma. Every therapist who provides skilled, compassionate treatment saves lives. Every researcher who advances our understanding brings us closer to better interventions. And every society that chooses to invest in trauma care rather than punishment or neglect moves toward a more humane future. PTSD is not a sign of weakness or moral failure. It is evidence of something important, that humans are capable of being deeply wounded by experience, precisely because we are capable of deep feeling, deep connection, and deep meaning. The same sensitivity that makes us vulnerable to trauma is what makes us human. And the capacity to heal from trauma, however long and difficult the journey, is testament to our resilience. The story of PTSD is not over. It is being written right now in VA hospitals and trauma centers, in therapists' offices and support groups, in the minds and hearts of survivors who wake up each day and choose to keep going despite the pain. It is being written by researchers in laboratories, by advocates in courtrooms and legislative chambers, and by communities learning to recognize and respond to trauma in all its forms. The men who came back from the trenches of the First World War shaking and mute, diagnosed with shell shock and treated with electric shocks, were not fundamentally different from the veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, the survivors of sexual assault, the first responders haunted by what they have seen, the children who grew up in homes marked by violence. They are all human beings whose minds have been overwhelmed by experiences too terrible to easily integrate. For too long, we looked away from this suffering. We denied it. We blamed those who experienced it. We locked them away in asylums or prisons or left them to struggle alone. We have come far from those dark days, but we still have far to go. The question now is not whether PTSD is real. The science is clear. The experiences of millions of survivors speak for themselves. The question is what we will do about it. Will we invest in the research, the treatment, the social support necessary to help people heal? Will we create a culture that allows trauma survivors to speak openly without shame? Will we address the root causes of trauma, war, violence, poverty, exploitation that creates suffering in the first place? These are not easy questions, and the answers will require sustained commitment and resources. But they are questions we cannot afford to ignore, because trauma does not simply affect the individuals who experience it. It ripples outward, affecting families, communities, and societies. Unhealed trauma perpetuates cycles of violence, addiction, and despair. But healed trauma can become a source of strength, compassion, and wisdom. The Complete History of PTSD is a story still being written. We are all part of that story, whether as survivors, as healers, as witnesses, or as members of a society that must choose whether to turn towards suffering or away from it. The legacy of the past teaches us the cost of denial. The science of the present gives us the tools to heal, and the future depends on the choices we make now. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the painful but essential history of PTSD. If this exploration has given you insight, if it has helped you understand the invisible wounds that so many carry, please share it. Let's continue this conversation. Let's demand better care for trauma survivors. Let's work to prevent trauma where we can, and to heal it where we cannot. And let's remember that behind every diagnosis, every statistic, every policy debate, is a human being who deserves compassion, dignity, and hope. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.